When my wife passed away, she left an $83 million inheritance. Thank God I didn't tell anyone, because at a family dinner, my son said, in front of everyone, that he would put me in a nursing home. I just smiled in silence. Subscribe to the channel for more stories like this, and comment the city you're watching from. The silence in our house was deafening. After 43 years of marriage, I had grown accustomed to Martha's gentle humming while she prepared breakfast, the soft shuffle of her slippers across the hardwood floors, and the way she'd call my name from the kitchen when the coffee was ready. Now, 3 months after her funeral, the quiet felt like a weight pressing down on my chest every morning when I woke up. I'm Timothy, and at 65 I never imagined I'd be learning how to live alone again. Martha had been my everything, my partner, my best friend, the person who made our modest 2-story home feel like the center of the universe. Without her, the rooms felt too big, too empty, like they were echoing with memories I wasn't ready to face. That Tuesday morning started like all the others since her passing. I made coffee for one, ate toast that tasted like cardboard, and tried to fill the hours until bedtime. I'd been avoiding going through Martha's personal belongings, but Dr. Peterson, our family lawyer, had called twice, reminding me about paperwork that needed attention. The estate couldn't remain in limbo forever, he'd said gently. So I climbed the stairs to our bedroom, each step heavier than the last. Martha's side of the closet still smelled like her lavender perfume. Her jewelry box sat untouched on the dresser, and I couldn't bring myself to open it. Instead, I focused on the practical things, bank statements, insurance papers, the mundane documents that somehow felt safer to handle. I was sorting through a stack of papers from her desk drawer when I found it. A thick manila envelope tucked behind her address book, sealed and marked with her careful handwriting, for Timothy, open after my passing. My hands trembled as I tore it open, wondering what final message she'd left for me. Inside was a letter in her familiar script, along with several legal documents I didn't immediately understand, but her words hit me like a physical blow. My dearest Timothy, if you're reading this, I'm no longer with you, and my heart breaks knowing the pain you must be feeling. There's something I never told you, something I kept secret to protect our family from people who might not have our best interests at heart. My father's estate, which I thought had been lost decades ago, was recovered by lawyers 3 years ago. I inherited everything: properties, investments, assets I never imagined still existed. The total value is approximately $83 million, and it's all yours now. I had to read that sentence 3 times before the numbers made sense. $83 million. I sank into Martha's reading chair, the papers scattered across my lap, trying to process what this meant. We'd lived modestly our entire marriage. I'd worked as a high school principal, Martha as a librarian. We'd saved carefully, worried about retirement funds, clipped coupons, and all this time, she'd been protecting a fortune. The letter continued. I never told you because I wanted us to live authentically, to know that the people in our lives loved us for who we were, not what we had. I've watched too many families destroyed by money, and I couldn't bear to see that happen to us. But now that I'm gone, this is yours to do with as you see fit. Trust your instincts about people, Timothy. Money has a way of revealing true character. The legal documents confirmed everything: bank accounts in Martha's maiden name, investment portfolios, property deeds, all of it now legally mine. The lawyers had been discreet, following Martha's explicit instructions to keep everything confidential until after her death. I sat there for hours, holding her letter, feeling the weight of this secret. Part of me was angry. How could she have kept something this enormous from me? But as I read her words again, I understood. She'd protected us, protected our simple life, protected the genuine relationships we'd built. That's when I thought about George. My son George had been distant since the funeral. Not openly cruel, but there was an impatience in his voice when he called, a hurried quality to his visits. He'd inherited my height, but none of Martha's warmth. At 38, he worked in real estate and had married Rebecca, a woman who smiled with her mouth but never her eyes. They lived in a sprawling suburban house 40 minutes away and visited maybe twice a month. Since Martha's death, those visits had become more sporadic. George would check on me with the efficiency of someone completing a task. "You doing okay, Dad? Need anything? House looking good." Then he'd be gone within an hour, usually with Rebecca calling from the car, urging him to hurry. I hadn't told anyone about the inheritance. Something in Martha's letter warned me to be careful, to observe, to see how people treated me when they thought I had nothing to offer but an aging man's company. And what I was seeing was making my heart ache in ways that had nothing to do with grief. Just last week, George had suggested I might want to think about downsizing. He'd said it casually, looking around our living room like he was appraising it. "This place is pretty big for just you, Dad. A lot of maintenance. Maybe something smaller would be easier to manage." Rebecca had nodded enthusiastically. "There are some lovely senior communities nearby, really nice places where you wouldn't have to worry about yard work or repairs." I'd smiled and said I wasn't ready for that yet, but I'd caught the look that passed between them. It wasn't concern for my well-being, it was calculation. Now, sitting in Martha's chair with 83 million reasons to see the world differently, I realized my wife had given me more than money. She'd given me a test, a way to see who really cared about Timothy the person, versus Timothy the potential burden or benefit. The afternoon light was fading through the bedroom windows. I carefully folded Martha's letter and placed it back in the envelope with all the financial documents. I locked everything in our old safe behind her wedding photo, a secret she'd kept for 3 years, that I would now keep for as long as necessary. As I made dinner for one again that evening, I found myself thinking about George's next visit. Would he ask how I was doing because he genuinely cared, or because he felt obligated? Would he stay for dinner and ask about my day, or would he check his watch and mention all the things he needed to get done? I was about to find out just how much my son really loved his father, and whether Martha's final gift would bring clarity or heartbreak to what remained of my family. The silence in the house felt different now, not empty, but full of possibilities I never could have imagined. George called the following Saturday morning, just as I was finishing my coffee and reading the newspaper. His voice had that brisk, businesslike tone I'd grown to recognize over the past few months. "Hey, Dad, Rebecca and I thought we'd stop by this afternoon. Maybe around 2. We've got some things to discuss with you." Things to discuss. Not, "We'd love to see you," or "We miss you." I felt a familiar knot forming in my stomach, but I kept my voice pleasant. "Of course, son, I'll be here." "Great. Oh, and Dad, maybe you could tidy up a bit before we come? The place looked pretty messy last time." I glanced around the living room. It was perfectly clean. Martha had taught me well, and my habits hadn't changed since her passing, but I simply said, "Sure, George." After he hung up, I sat there holding the phone, feeling something cold settle in my chest. Tidy up a bit, as if I were a child who couldn't manage basic housekeeping. As if my home, our home, wasn't good enough for his brief visit. I spent the morning, as I always did, reading, paying bills, tending to Martha's garden. But there was a tension now, a sense of waiting for something unpleasant. I found myself noticing things I'd taken for granted, the way the afternoon light hit Martha's favorite reading corner, the comfort of familiar furniture we'd chosen together decades ago, things that suddenly felt precious, as if they might be threatened. George and Rebecca arrived at exactly 2 o'clock. I watched from the window as they sat in their black SUV for several minutes before getting out, Rebecca typing on her phone while George reviewed what looked like documents. There was something strategic about the delay, as if they were preparing for a business meeting rather than visiting family. "Hi, Dad," George said when I opened the door, giving me a perfunctory hug. Rebecca followed with her practiced smile, the one that never reached her eyes. "Timothy, you look well," she said, though her gaze was already moving past me, scanning the room behind me with an appraiser's attention to detail. We settled in the living room, and I offered them coffee or tea. They both declined. Rebecca pulled out a small notebook, and George cleared his throat in a way that reminded me of when he was 12 and had to confess to breaking something. "Dad, we wanted to talk to you about some practical matters," he began. "It's been almost 4 months since Mom died, and we think it's time to start making some decisions about your future." Your future, not our future as a family, not how we could support each other through grief. My future, as if it were a problem they needed to solve. What kind of decisions? I asked carefully. Rebecca jumped in, her voice taking on that overly sweet tone people use when they're about to say something you won't want to hear. Well, Timothy, we're concerned about you living in this big house all alone. It's a lot of responsibility for someone your age. Someone your age. I was 65, not 90. I still drove, paid my bills, maintained the house, cooked my meals. But in Rebecca's voice, I heard the assumption that I was somehow failing at basic life functions. George leaned forward, warming to the theme. The thing is, Dad, this place is really too much for one person. 4 bedrooms, 2.5 baths, that big yard. Mom was the one who really managed everything, wasn't she? I felt heat rising in my face. Martha and I had been partners in everything. She'd handled some things, I'd handled others. But we'd managed our home together for over 4 decades. To suggest I'd been some helpless dependent was not just wrong, it was insulting. I've been managing just fine, I said evenly. Have you? Rebecca's eyebrows rose, because when we were here last week I noticed the garden looking a bit overgrown, and there were dishes in the sink. 2 coffee cups. I'd had 2 coffee cups in the sink from breakfast. Martha and I used to leave dishes until evening sometimes when we were busy with other things. It was normal. But Rebecca made it sound like evidence of decline. George pulled out a folder. We've been doing some research, Dad. There are some really nice places specifically designed for people in your situation. Assisted living communities where you wouldn't have to worry about maintenance, cooking, cleaning. You could just relax and enjoy yourself. I don't need assisted living, I said, more sharply than I intended. I'm not disabled. I'm not sick. I'm just alone. The word hung in the air, heavier than I'd meant it to be. For just a moment, I thought I saw something like sympathy in George's eyes, but Rebecca was already talking again. That's exactly our point, Timothy. You shouldn't have to be alone with all these responsibilities. These places have wonderful social activities, meals provided, housekeeping services. Think of it as a chance to start fresh, meet new people, not be burdened with all this upkeep. Burdened. She was talking about the home where I'd raised my son, where Martha and I had built our life together, as if it were a burden. Have you actually visited any of these places? I asked. George and Rebecca exchanged a quick glance. Well, not yet, George admitted, but we've looked at websites, read reviews. There's one called Sunset Manor that looks really nice. Very clean, professional staff. They were talking about moving me to a place they'd never seen, away from everything familiar based on internet research. I felt my hands clench in my lap, but I kept my voice calm. I appreciate your concern, but I'm not ready to make any major changes right now. I'm still grieving your mother, and this house, it's where I feel closest to her. Rebecca's smile became more strained. Timothy, I understand that this is emotional for you, but we have to think practically. What if something happens to you here? What if you fall or have a medical emergency? Who would know? I have neighbors, friends from church. Dr. Morrison checks on me regularly. But it's not the same as having professional care available 24 hours a day, George insisted. Dad, we're not saying this to hurt you. We're trying to plan ahead, to make sure you're safe and taken care of. Taken care of. The phrase stuck in my throat. When had I become someone who needed to be taken care of rather than someone capable of making my own decisions? Can I ask you something? I said quietly. Do you enjoy visiting me here? George looked surprised by the question. What do you mean? I mean exactly that. When you come here, do you enjoy spending time with me? Do you look forward to our visits? There was a pause that lasted too long. Rebecca filled it quickly. Of course we do, Timothy. We love you. That's why we want what's best for you. But I'd seen the hesitation, I'd heard the silence, and sitting there in my living room, surrounded by 43 years of memories, I realized something that cut deeper than grief. My son didn't enjoy my company. These visits weren't acts of love. They were obligations, tasks to be completed, problems to be managed. Well, I said finally, I appreciate you both taking the time to think about my situation, but I'm not ready to make any decisions right now. George's jaw tightened slightly. "Dad, you can't just ignore reality. Mom's gone. Things have to change." "Some things," I agreed, "but not everything. And not on anyone's timeline but my own." They left shortly after that, with promises to continue the conversation and suggestions that I really think about what we've discussed. I watched from the window as they sat in their car again before driving away, heads bent together in intense conversation. As evening fell, I made myself dinner and ate it at the kitchen table where Martha and I had shared thousands of meals. The silence was back, but it felt different now. Not empty, but protective, like a shield around something precious that needed guarding. I thought about the secret upstairs in the safe, $83 million that could change everything about this conversation. That could make George and Rebecca see me as someone worth listening to, worth respecting, someone whose decisions mattered. But Martha's words echoed in my mind. Money has a way of revealing true character. I was beginning to understand that the test wasn't just about how people treated me when they thought I had nothing. It was about discovering who they really were when they believed they had power over me. And what I was discovering was breaking my heart. The invitation came a week later, written in Rebecca's perfect handwriting on expensive cream-colored cardstock. "You're invited to celebrate George's 39th birthday. Family dinner at our home, Saturday at 6 p.m. We can't wait to see you." The exclamation points felt forced, like punctuation marks trying to inject enthusiasm where none existed. But it was the first time in months they'd invited me to anything, so I found myself genuinely hopeful. Maybe our conversation had made them realize they'd been too pushy. Maybe this was their way of rebuilding our relationship. I spent Saturday afternoon getting ready with more care than I'd taken in months. I pressed my best shirt. The blue one, Martha always said, brought out my eyes. I wrapped George's gift carefully, a leather-bound journal with his initials embossed on the cover, something thoughtful rather than expensive. I even stopped at the bakery to pick up his favorite chocolate cake, the one they'd made for his birthdays when he was little. The drive to their house took me through neighborhoods that had changed dramatically since George was young. Where there used to be modest family homes, now there were sprawling developments with names like Windsor Estates and Crown Ridge. George and Rebecca's house fit right in. A massive colonial with perfectly manicured landscaping and a circular driveway that could accommodate a small party. Cars lined the street when I arrived, more than I'd expected for a family dinner. Through the large front windows, I could see people moving around inside, cocktails in hand. The warm glow of what looked like quite a gathering. My heart sank a little. I'd hoped for intimate conversation, a chance to reconnect with my son. Instead, it looked like I was walking into a party where I'd be just another guest. Rebecca answered the door wearing a black cocktail dress that probably cost more than I spent on groceries in a month. Her smile was bright, but her eyes did that quick scan they always did, checking my appearance like a security guard at an airport. "Timothy, you made it. Come in, come in. Everyone's so excited to see you." Everyone. I followed her into the living room, which had been transformed into a party space with catered appetizers, a full bar setup, and at least 20 people I didn't recognize. The few familiar faces were George's college friends and Rebecca's relatives, people who knew me only as George's father, if they knew me at all. George appeared with a bourbon in his hand, looking relaxed and confident in his element. "Dad, glad you could make it. Let me introduce you to some people." For the next hour, I found myself passed from conversation to conversation like a pleasant but forgettable accessory. "This is my father, Timothy. Dad, this is Mike from work. Timothy, meet Rebecca's sister, Jennifer." Handshakes, polite smiles, brief exchanges about my health, the weather, how nice the house looked. Then I'd be gently moved along to the next group, while more interesting people claimed George's attention. I ended up standing near the kitchen holding a glass of wine I didn't really want, watching my son hold court in his own living room. He was animated, funny, charming, everything I remembered from his childhood when he'd tell elaborate stories about school or his friends. But that warmth, that energy, wasn't directed toward me. I was background, scenery in his life, rather than a central figure. "Your son has done very well for himself," said a woman I'd been introduced to earlier, Sandra something, Rebecca's friend from yoga class. She was looking around the house with obvious admiration. "Real estate must be very lucrative." "Yes, he's worked hard," I replied, though honestly, I wasn't sure how hard George worked. Martha used to worry that success had come too easily for him, that he'd never learned to struggle for anything important. "And Rebecca tells me you're thinking about making some lifestyle changes yourself?" Sandra continued, her voice taking on that careful tone people use when they're fishing for information. My stomach tightened. "I'm sorry?" "Oh, downsizing. Maybe moving somewhere with less responsibility? I think it's wonderful when people are proactive about planning for their golden years." Rebecca had been talking about our private conversation, sharing details about my supposed need for assisted living with her yoga friends, discussing my business at what was essentially a cocktail party. The wine suddenly tasted bitter in my mouth. "I haven't made any firm plans," I said carefully. Sandra nodded knowingly. "Of course, it's a big decision, but George and Rebecca seem to have found some wonderful options for you. They're such devoted children, thinking ahead like that." Devoted children. I excused myself and walked to the bathroom, needing a moment away from the noise and the casual invasion of my privacy. In the mirror, I looked older than I remembered, more fragile somehow. Was this how everyone saw me? As someone whose decisions were already being made by other people? When I returned to the party, dinner was being served. Rebecca had set up a buffet in the dining room with catered food that smelled wonderful and probably cost more than I usually spend on groceries in a week. I found myself seated at a small table near the kitchen door with two elderly relatives of Rebecca's who spent most of the meal discussing their various medical procedures. George sat at the head of the main table, surrounded by his friends and colleagues, telling stories and laughing loudly. From my position, I could see him, but might as well have been watching through a window. This was his world, his people, his celebration. I was just someone who shared his DNA. After dinner, Rebecca called for everyone's attention. "Before we do cake, George has something he wants to share with everyone." My son stood up, slightly flushed from wine and attention, and raised his glass. "Thank you all for being here tonight." 39 years old. Getting up there, right? Laughter from the crowd. "But seriously, Rebecca and I have been doing a lot of thinking lately about family, about responsibility, about taking care of the people we love." He paused, and something in his tone made me pay closer attention. There was a gravity there that hadn't been present all evening. "Some of you know that we lost my mother, Martha, a few months ago. It's been hard on all of us, but especially on my father." He gestured toward me, and suddenly every face in the room was turned in my direction. I felt heat rising in my cheeks. Dad's been struggling with living alone in the family house, and Rebecca and I have been trying to figure out the best way to help him. My mouth went dry. This wasn't a birthday toast. It was a public announcement about my private business. I wanted to stand up to stop him, but I was frozen in my chair. "We've found a wonderful assisted living facility called Sunset Manor. It's got everything: professional care, social activities, beautiful grounds. Dad's been resistant to the idea, but we think it's really the best option for everyone involved." Murmurs of approval around the room, nods of understanding. Several people looking at me with that particular expression of pity reserved for elderly people who can't make good decisions for themselves. So, tonight, I want to announce that we're going to help Dad make this transition. It's time for him to stop worrying about house maintenance and yard work and start enjoying his retirement. Sometimes you have to make the hard decisions for the people you love, even when they don't want to hear it. The room erupted in applause. People were smiling at me, nodding approvingly, raising their glasses in my direction. I heard fragments of conversation. "How thoughtful. Such a good son. He's lucky to have family who care." I sat there with a frozen smile on my face while my son received congratulations for making a decision about my life without consulting me, for announcing to a room full of strangers that I was incapable of managing my own affairs, for turning my future into entertainment for his birthday party. Rebecca appeared beside me with a slice of chocolate cake. "Isn't it wonderful, Timothy? We've already made some preliminary arrangements. You won't have to worry about anything." I looked up at her, then across the room at George, who was still basking in the approval of his guests. The man who had once been my little boy, who I'd taught to ride a bike and helped with homework and cheered for at Little League games, had just publicly declared me incompetent. "Wonderful," I managed to say, my voice barely audible over the party noise. "We'll handle all the details," Rebecca continued. "The paperwork, the moving arrangements, everything. You just need to focus on getting excited about your new adventure." Adventure. As if being shipped off to a facility against my will was some kind of vacation opportunity. I stayed until the end of the party, accepting condolences disguised as congratulations, listening to advice about adjusting to institutional life, watching my son receive praise for his mature handling of a difficult family situation. When it was time to leave, George walked me to my car with the casual air of someone who had just solved a complex problem. "Thanks for coming tonight, Dad. I know this is a big change, but you're going to love Sunset Manor. We'll visit all the time." I nodded and got into my car without trusting myself to speak. As I drove home through the quiet suburban streets, my hands were shaking on the steering wheel. Not from age or infirmity, but from rage and humiliation so deep I could barely breathe. When I got home, I sat in my driveway for a long time before going inside. The house was dark and quiet, filled with the ghosts of a life I'd apparently lost the right to choose for myself. But upstairs in the safe, Martha's letter was waiting, along with documentation of $83 million that could change this entire conversation. George thought he was making decisions for a helpless old man. He had no idea who he was really dealing with. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in the bed Martha and I had shared for 4 decades, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of George's announcement, the way he'd smiled while describing my supposed incompetence, the approving nods from strangers who didn't know me but felt qualified to agree with my exile, the casual assumption that my life was theirs to reorganize. By dawn, something had crystallized inside me, not anger anymore. Anger was too hot, too emotional for what needed to be done. This was colder, clearer, a decision that felt as inevitable as sunrise. I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table with Martha's letter spread out in front of me. Her words seemed to glow in the morning light. "Trust your instincts about people, Timothy. Money has a way of revealing true character." She'd given me more than an inheritance. She'd given me a test, and George had failed it spectacularly. Not just failed. He'd shown me exactly who he was when he thought I had no power, no choices, no voice that mattered. I picked up the phone and dialed Dr. Peterson's office. His secretary said he could see me that afternoon if it was urgent. It was. Dr. Peterson had been our family lawyer for 20 years, a quiet man in his 70s with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He'd handled Martha's will, knew about the inheritance, had been discreetly managing the legal transfer of assets while I processed my grief. "Timothy," he said when I walked into his office that Monday afternoon, "how are you holding up?" "I need to make some changes to my estate planning," I said without preamble. "Significant changes." He gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Of course. What did you have in mind?" I told him about George's announcement, about the assisted living facility I'd never seen, about decisions being made for me by people who saw me as a burden to be managed rather than a person to be respected. Dr. Peterson listened without interruption, his expression growing more serious with each detail. "I see," he said finally. "And you want to modify your will to reflect this situation?" "I want to create a charitable foundation," I said, "something that will honor Martha's memory and support causes she cared about. Literacy programs, library funding, scholarships for education majors. I want the vast majority of the inheritance to go there." Dr. Peterson made notes on a legal pad. "What about George? Do you want to leave him anything?" I thought about that. In my anger the night before, I'd imagined cutting him off completely. But Martha wouldn't have wanted that. And despite everything, George was still my son. "A modest inheritance," I said finally. "Enough to show that I didn't forget him, but not enough to validate what he did to me. Maybe $100,000. And the foundation would receive the remainder?" We're talking about approximately $82 million, Timothy. Yes, and I want it structured so that if anyone contests the will or tries to claim incompetence, they forfeit even that modest inheritance. I want it bulletproof. Dr. Peterson nodded slowly. That can certainly be arranged. But Timothy, this is a significant decision. Are you sure you don't want to take some time to think about it? Maybe have a conversation with George first? The conversation happened at his birthday party, I said, in front of 20 strangers who got to vote on my future. He made his choice. Now I'm making mine. We spent the next 2 hours working through the details. Dr. Peterson was thorough, making sure I understood every aspect of what I was doing. The foundation would be established immediately, but funded only after my death. I would retain enough of the inheritance to live comfortably, more than comfortably, for the rest of my life. But the bulk of Martha's gift would go to help others rather than enriching people who saw me as an inconvenience. There's something else, I said as we were finishing up. I want to make arrangements for my own living situation, not assisted living, something better. Dr. Peterson raised an eyebrow. What did you have in mind? I've been researching luxury retirement communities, active adult communities where people choose to live, not places where they're sent. I want to tour some options this week. He smiled for the first time since I'd arrived. Now that sounds like a plan worthy of your circumstances, Timothy. I left his office feeling lighter than I had in months. For the first time since Martha's death, I was making decisions for myself, taking control of my own future instead of waiting for other people to determine what was best for me. That evening, I called 3 retirement communities within a reasonable driving distance. Not the institutional facilities George and Rebecca had researched online, but places that advertised themselves as resorts for active seniors, golf courses, fitness centers, cultural activities, fine dining. Communities where people lived because they wanted to, not because their children thought they had to. The first place I visited was Meadowbrook Estates, about an hour north of my current home. The sales representative, an energetic woman named Carol, gave me a tour that took my breath away. Individual homes with private gardens, a clubhouse that looked like a luxury hotel, activities ranging from art classes to wine tastings to travel groups. The residents I met seemed genuinely happy, engaged, surrounded by peers who'd chosen this lifestyle rather than having it imposed on them. Most of our residents are people who want to simplify their lives without sacrificing quality, Carol explained as we walked through the woodworking shop where a retired engineer was crafting a rocking chair. They're tired of maintaining large homes, but not ready to give up independence or activities they enjoy. What's the financial structure? I asked. She handed me a brochure. We have several options. You can purchase a home outright, or there's a life care contract that includes housing, meals, activities, and health care services. The life care option runs about $8,000 a month, but it covers everything, even assisted living or nursing care if it's ever needed. $8,000 a month. With my new financial situation, that was almost irrelevant. I could afford the most expensive option without touching the principal of Martha's inheritance. The second community I visited, Riverside Gardens, was even more impressive. Situated on a lake with walking trails and a marina, it felt more like a resort than a retirement home. The residents I met were vibrant, engaged people who'd chosen to live there rather than aging in place. Many were younger than I was, early retirees who'd sold large homes and moved to the community for the lifestyle it offered. By Wednesday, I'd made my decision. Riverside Gardens offered everything I wanted: independence, dignity, activities I'd enjoy, and most importantly, the respect of being treated as someone capable of making my own choices. I put down a deposit on a 2-bedroom cottage with a view of the lake. The move-in date could be as early as next month if I wanted. Thursday morning, I called a real estate agent about listing my house. The same house George thought was too much for me to handle, that Rebecca saw as evidence of my decline. It would likely sell for close to $400,000, money I could use for the move and to establish myself in my new community. That afternoon, George called. "Hey, Dad, how are you feeling about everything? Rebecca found some brochures for Sunset Manor she wanted to show you." Maybe we could come by this weekend and go through them together? I looked out the window at Martha's garden, at the home we'd built together, at the life I was choosing to leave on my own terms rather than having it taken from me. That won't be necessary, George, I said calmly. I've made other arrangements. There was a pause. What do you mean, other arrangements? I mean, I've decided where I want to live, and it's not Sunset Manor. Dad, you can't just make decisions like this without discussing them with us. We've already talked to the people at Sunset Manor. They're expecting you. Us. As if my living situation was a group project rather than my personal choice. George, I said, my voice steady and calm, I'm 65 years old. I've been making my own decisions for almost 5 decades. I don't need permission from anyone to choose where I want to live. But Dad, you don't understand all the financial implications, the logistics involved. Rebecca and I have been researching this for weeks, without asking me what I wanted. Another pause. We thought you'd have trouble making objective decisions about something this emotional. There it was. The assumption that grief had made me incompetent, that losing my wife meant losing my ability to think clearly about my own life. I'll be in touch, I said, and hung up. Saturday morning, I was in my driveway loading boxes into my car when George's SUV pulled up. He and Rebecca got out looking confused and alarmed. Dad, what's going on? Are you giving things away? I straightened up, looking at my son and daughter-in-law with the clarity that comes from finally understanding a situation completely. I'm packing, I said simply. I'm moving to a community called Riverside Gardens next month. Rebecca's face went pale. Timothy, you can't just move somewhere without proper research, without visiting, without understanding what you're getting into. I've visited, I've researched, I've made my choice. George stepped closer, his voice taking on that patronizing tone I'd grown to hate. Dad, this is exactly what we were worried about. You're making major life decisions without thinking them through. I looked at him for a long moment. My son, who'd announced my future to a room full of strangers, who'd never asked what I wanted, only told me what he'd decided I needed. George, I said quietly, there's something I think you should know, but not yet. Not until I was safely established in my new life, surrounded by my own choices rather than his assumptions. The revelation would come when I was ready, when I had the power, rather than being at the mercy of other people's decisions about my competence. I'll call you when I'm settled, I said, and went back to loading my car. As they drove away, I could see them through the rear window, heads bent together in intense conversation, planning their next move, no doubt, trying to figure out how to regain control of a situation that had never been theirs to control in the first place. But it was too late for that. The test was over, and they had shown me exactly who they were. Now it was time for me to show them who I really was. 2 weeks after I'd moved into my cottage at Riverside Gardens, George showed up unannounced. I was on my back patio, reading the morning paper and enjoying coffee that actually tasted good. One of the unexpected pleasures of my new life was discovering that the community's cafe served better coffee than I'd ever made at home. Through the sliding glass door, I could see him standing on my front step, looking around with an expression I couldn't quite read. Confusion, maybe, or calculation. My cottage was modest by Riverside Gardens standards, but it was clearly expensive. The manicured landscaping, the lake view, the obvious quality of the construction, none of it matched his narrative about his incompetent father making poor decisions. I took my time getting to the door, let him wait, let him wonder. Dad, he said when I finally opened it, trying to look casual but failing. Nice place. Can I come in? I stepped aside without saying anything. George walked into my living room and I watched his eyes take inventory. The furniture I'd brought from home looked better here somehow, more intentional. The lake view through the large windows was undeniably beautiful. Everything was clean, organized, peaceful. Coffee? I offered. Sure. I poured him a cup from the pot I'd made earlier, watching as he continued to scan the room. When I handed him the mug, he finally met my eyes. This is pretty nice, Dad. How much is this place costing you? There it was, the real reason for his visit. Not concern for my well-being, not interest in whether I was happy or settling in, well, money. He wanted to know how much of his potential inheritance I was spending on my own comfort. I can afford it, I said simply. But Dad, the monthly fees for these places can be enormous. Are you sure you've thought this through? What happens if you run out of money? I almost laughed. If I ran out of money? George had no idea that I could afford to live at Riverside Gardens for several lifetimes without touching the principle of Martha's inheritance. I'm financially secure, George. You don't need to worry about that. He frowned, clearly unsatisfied with my answer. But the house sale won't cover this kind of expense for very long. These luxury places, they prey on seniors who don't understand the long-term costs. Prey on seniors. His condescension was breathtaking. Even here, in my own home that I'd chosen and paid for myself, he couldn't accept that I might be capable of making sound financial decisions. George, I said, sitting down across from him, why are you really here? He had the grace to look slightly embarrassed. Rebecca and I are concerned. You moved out of the family home without discussing it with us. You're spending money on this place that you might need for health care later, and you're not returning our calls. I returned your call last week. You left a voicemail saying you were fine. That's not the same as having a conversation. I studied my son's face. Even now, sitting in my beautiful new home, seeing evidence that I was thriving rather than declining, he couldn't let go of the narrative that I needed to be managed, that my choices were symptoms of confusion rather than expressions of autonomy. What kind of conversation would satisfy you? I asked. One where we talk about practical matters, like what happens when this place gets too expensive, like whether you've made arrangements for health care, like your will and estate planning. There it was. The real concern, not my happiness or well-being, but the money. What was left of it? Who would inherit it? How my choices might affect his financial future? I set down my coffee cup and looked directly at him. George, do you love me? The question seemed to catch him off guard. What? Of course I love you, Dad. You're my father. You enjoy spending time with me? What kind of question is that? A simple one. When you think about visiting me, you look forward to it. You like my company. He shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Dad, this is a weird conversation. Is it? Because I've been thinking a lot lately about what family means, about what love looks like, and I'm not sure we agree on the definition. George's jaw tightened. If this is about the birthday party, I was trying to help you. Sometimes people need to hear difficult truths from people who care about them. You announced to a room full of strangers that I was incompetent to manage my own life. You made that decision without asking what I wanted. How exactly was that helpful? Because you weren't being realistic. Dad, you were rattling around in that big house, barely taking care of yourself, refusing to acknowledge that things needed to change, barely taking care of myself. I felt that familiar cold anger settling in my chest. What gave you that impression? The dishes in the sink, the overgrown garden, the fact that you weren't answering your phone half the time. I had 2 coffee cups in the sink one morning. The garden needed weeding, something I was perfectly capable of doing myself. And I didn't answer the phone because I was grieving my wife and didn't always feel like talking. None of that makes me incompetent. George ran his hands through his hair in frustration. Look, maybe we handled it wrong, but our hearts were in the right place. We want what's best for you. Do you? Or do you want what's easiest for you? The question hung in the air between us. George's face flushed, and I could see him struggling with how to respond. Part of me hoped he would surprise me, that he would acknowledge his mistakes, apologize for the assumptions he'd made, show some genuine remorse for the way he'd treated me. Instead, he got angry. That's not fair, Dad. We've been trying to help you through a difficult time, and you're acting like we're the enemy. Maybe the problem isn't us. Maybe the problem is that you can't accept that you need help. There it was, the final confirmation of everything I'd suspected. Even confronted with evidence that I was managing just fine, George couldn't abandon his narrative. I wasn't a person making autonomous choices. I was a problem to be solved. I stood up slowly, walked to the window, and looked out at the lake. A group of residents was gathered on the dock, preparing for their morning sailing excursion. People my age and older, living active, engaged lives because they'd chosen to, because they'd been treated as adults capable of making decisions about their own futures. George, I said without turning around, there's something I need to tell you. What? I walked to my desk, pulled out a folder I'd prepared for this moment, and set it on the coffee table between us. Your mother left me something when she died. Something significant. George glanced at the folder but didn't reach for it. What kind of something? An inheritance from her family's estate. Money that she kept secret during our marriage to protect us from people who might not have our best interests at heart. Now I had his attention. George straightened in his chair, his eyes fixed on the folder. How much money? I opened the folder and slid a bank statement across the table. George picked it up, and I watched his face change as he processed the numbers. His eyes widened, then his mouth opened slightly. Then he looked up at me with an expression I'd never seen before. $83 million? Approximately, yes. George stared at the paper, then at me, then back at the paper. Dad, how long have you known about this? Since shortly after your mother's funeral. She left me a letter explaining everything. And you didn't tell us? I sat back down, meeting his gaze steadily. No, I didn't tell you. Why not? This was the moment I've been both dreading and anticipating for months. The moment when I would have to tell my son exactly what I thought of his character. Because I wanted to see how you would treat me when you thought I had nothing to offer but an old man's company. I wanted to know if you loved me for who I am, or just tolerated me out of obligation. George's face went white. Dad, that's not... We do love you. Do you? Because when you thought I was just a widowed retiree with a modest pension, you couldn't wait to ship me off to the cheapest facility you could find. You announced my incompetence to a room full of strangers. You never once asked what I wanted or how I felt about your plans. We were trying to help, he said weakly. You were trying to get rid of a problem. The difference is significant. George looked down at the bank statement again, and I could see his mind working, calculating, planning, already thinking about how this changed things, how he could position himself to benefit from this revelation. So what does this mean, he asked. For us, I mean, for the family. Yeah, it means, I said carefully, that I've had time to see who you really are when you think I have no power. And based on that knowledge, I've made some decisions about my future. What kind of decisions? I pulled out another document from the folder. My new will, signed and notarized 3 weeks ago. I've established a charitable foundation in your mother's memory. It will support literacy programs, library funding, and educational scholarships. The vast majority of the inheritance will go there when I die. George's hand tightened on the bank statement. The vast majority? $82 million, give or take. You'll receive $100,000, enough to show that I didn't forget you, but not enough to justify the way you've treated me. The silence that followed was deafening. I watched my son process this information, watched him realize that his assumptions about his future inheritance had been wildly incorrect, that his treatment of me over the past months hadn't just been morally wrong, it had been financially catastrophic. Dad, he said finally, his voice shaky, you can't be serious. I'm completely serious. But we're family. That money should stay in the family. It is staying in the family. The family of people who believe in education and literacy, the causes your mother cared about. People who will use it to help others rather than to justify treating elderly parents like burdens. George stood up abruptly, pacing to the window and back. This is insane. You're making decisions based on emotions, based on hurt feelings. You're throwing away generational wealth because you didn't like how we handled one situation. One situation? I felt my voice rising for the first time in this conversation. George, you spent months treating me like I was incompetent. You made decisions about my life without consulting me. You publicly humiliated me at your birthday party. This wasn't one situation. This was a pattern of behavior that showed me exactly how much respect you have for me as a person. We made mistakes, okay? We can fix this. We can do better. Now he wanted to do better. Now that he knew what was at stake financially. George, I said sadly, the fact that you're only interested in doing better now that you know about the money proves my point. This conversation would be going very differently if I'd told you I was broke, wouldn't it? He didn't answer, which was answer enough. I walked to the front door and opened it. I think you should go now. George didn't move. Dad, please, let's talk about this rationally. You're upset, and I understand that, but you can't just throw away our relationship over this. I'm not throwing it away, George. You did that months ago when you decided I was a problem to be managed instead of a person to be respected. He stood there for another moment, the bank statement still clutched in his hand, his face cycling through emotions I'd never seen before. Shock, anger, desperation, calculation. Finally, he walked to the door, but instead of leaving, he turned back to me. "This isn't over, Dad. Family doesn't just give up on each other." "You're right," I said quietly. "Family doesn't give up on each other, but you gave up on me a long time ago. You just didn't realize it until now." After he left, I sat in my living room for a long time, looking out at the lake. I felt lighter somehow, as if a weight I'd been carrying for months had finally been lifted. The test was over. The truth was out, and I was exactly where I belonged. 6 months later, I was standing in the Riverside Gardens Community Center watching a group of residents rehearse for our spring talent show. Margaret was playing piano, while Harold sang an old Frank Sinatra song with surprising skill. In the corner, Betty was putting finishing touches on a watercolor painting that would be displayed in our upcoming art exhibition. These people had become my chosen family, people who valued each other's company, who supported each other's interests, who treated each other with the dignity that comes from mutual respect. The phone calls from George had stopped after the first month. Initially, he'd called every few days, his tone cycling between apologetic and demanding. Sometimes he wanted to work things out. Other times he insisted I was being unreasonable and punishing the family for his mistakes. Rebecca had called twice, her voice sugar-sweet as she explained how sorry they both were, how they'd learned from this experience, how family should forgive and move forward. I'd listened politely to all of it, but my decision remained unchanged. Martha's letter had been clear. Trust your instincts about people. My instincts had been proven correct in the most painful way possible. The charitable foundation was thriving. Dr. Peterson called regularly with updates about the grants we were providing to rural libraries, the scholarships being awarded to education majors, the literacy programs being funded in underserved communities. Martha would have been proud to see her secret inheritance helping the causes she'd cared about most. But the real transformation was in my own life. At Riverside Gardens, I wasn't Timothy the burden or Timothy the problem to be solved. I was simply Timothy, a man who enjoyed morning walks around the lake, who'd joined the book club and discovered a love for contemporary fiction, who'd started taking photography classes and found he had an eye for capturing the beauty in everyday moments. Last month, I'd begun dating Sarah, a retired English professor whose husband had died 3 years ago. She was intelligent, funny, and treated me like an equal partner in whatever we chose to do together. We took day trips to art museums, cooked dinner together in my cottage kitchen, and spent long evenings talking about books and travel and the strange freedom that comes with starting over later in life. "You seem lighter lately," she'd said the night before, as we sat on my patio watching the sunset over the lake. "More at peace with yourself?" She was right. The anger I'd carried for months had gradually transformed into something else. Not forgiveness exactly, George hadn't earned that, but a kind of acceptance. He'd shown me who he was, and I'd responded accordingly. There was no more waiting for him to change, no more hoping he would suddenly develop the capacity for genuine love and respect. I'd stopped carrying the weight of other people's expectations and started living for my own happiness. That afternoon, as I was returning from a photography walk around the grounds, I found a familiar car in my driveway. George's black SUV with him and Rebecca sitting inside like they'd been working up the courage to knock on my door. I felt a familiar tightness in my chest, but it was different now. Not the anxious dread I used to feel when they visited, but something more like mild annoyance. They no longer had the power to disrupt my peace. They got out of the car as I approached, both of them looking older somehow. George had gained weight, and there were stress lines around his eyes that hadn't been there 6 months ago. Rebecca's smile seemed forced, brittle. "Dad," George said, his voice carefully neutral. "We were hoping we could talk." I unlocked my front door and gestured for them to come in. They settled on my couch while I remained standing, making it clear this wouldn't be a long visit. You look good, Timothy, Rebecca said, glancing around the room. This place really suits you. Thank you. George cleared his throat. Dad, we wanted to come here to apologize. Properly. We've had time to think about everything that happened, and we realize we handled things badly. I waited. There was more coming. We were wrong to make decisions about your life without consulting you, he continued. We were wrong to assume you couldn't take care of yourself. We were wrong about a lot of things. Yes, I said simply. You were. Rebecca leaned forward, her hands clasped together. Timothy, we're family. Families make mistakes, but they also forgive each other. We're hoping you can find it in your heart to give us another chance. Another chance. I looked at these two people who'd spent months treating me like an incompetent burden, who'd only discovered their capacity for apology after learning about my financial situation, who were now asking for forgiveness while still not understanding what they'd actually done wrong. George, I said, do you remember what you said to me the last time you were here? About how this wasn't over because family doesn't give up on each other? He nodded hopefully. You were right about that. Family doesn't give up on each other. But here's what I've learned. Family isn't just about blood relations. It's about people who respect each other, who support each other's choices, who treat each other with dignity, even when they disagree. I walked to the window, looking out at the community where I'd found exactly that kind of family. For months, you treated me like I was a problem to be solved, rather than a person to be respected. You made assumptions about my competence, my judgment, my ability to manage my own life. You announced decisions about my future to strangers without ever asking what I wanted. We know that now, George said quickly. We've learned from our mistakes. Have you? Or have you learned that treating elderly parents badly might have financial consequences? The question hung in the air. Rebecca shifted uncomfortably, and George's jaw tightened slightly. The same expression he'd worn as a child when caught in a lie. Dad, that's not fair. This isn't about money, isn't it? Because you had 6 months to apologize before you knew about the inheritance. 6 months to realize you'd treated me poorly and try to make amends. But you didn't. You only discovered your capacity for remorse after learning what your behavior might cost you. I turned back to face them, feeling calmer than I had in any of our previous conversations. I've made a new life here, George. I have friends who enjoy my company. I have activities that engage me. I have respect from people who see me as a capable adult making his own choices. I'm not angry with you anymore because I don't need your approval or validation. I have those things from people who actually care about me. We do care about you, Rebecca said, her voice cracking slightly. We love you. Perhaps you do, in your way. But love without respect isn't enough, and respect can't be retroactively applied when someone learns you have something they want. George stood up abruptly. So that's it? You're just cutting us out of your life permanently? I'm not cutting you out, George. I'm simply choosing not to center my life around people who don't value me unless I have something they need. There's a difference. What about holidays, family gatherings? What about when you get older and actually do need help? I smiled at that. I'm part of a community now. People here look out for each other. We have support systems, social connections, shared interests. When I need help, I'll have it, from people who offer it out of genuine care rather than guilty obligation. They exchanged a look, and I could see them realizing that their visit wasn't going to accomplish what they'd hoped. The will, George said finally. You could change it. You could still make things right. Things are right, George. For the first time in months, things are exactly as they should be. We stood there in silence for a moment. I felt no satisfaction in their obvious distress, but I felt no guilt either. They'd made their choices, and now they were living with the consequences, just as I was living with mine. I should probably go, George said finally. But Dad, the door's still open, right? If things change, if we can prove that we've really learned from this. I considered his question carefully. George, I hope you do learn from this. I hope you develop the capacity to treat people with respect, regardless of what they can offer you. But whether that happens or not, I'm content with my life as it is. After they left, I made myself a cup of tea and called Sarah. She listened as I told her about the visit, offering no advice but simply being present as I processed the emotions. How do you feel? She asked when I finished. Free, I said, surprised by the truth of it. For the first time in my adult life, I feel completely free. That evening, I walked down to the lake and sat on the dock as the sun set behind the trees. Tomorrow, I would meet the book club to discuss our latest selection. This weekend, Sarah and I planned to drive to a nearby town for their antique fair. Next month, I was signed up for a photography workshop in the mountains. I thought about Martha, about the secret she'd kept to protect us from people who might not have our best interests at heart. She'd given me more than money. She'd given me the tools to discover who truly belonged in my life and who didn't. The foundation bearing her name would continue her legacy of supporting education and literacy. But perhaps more importantly, her final gift had taught me that it's never too late to choose dignity over obligation, respect over mere family ties, authentic love over conditional acceptance. At 75 years old, I was finally living the life I wanted rather than the life other people thought I should have. Some people might call that selfish. I called it liberation. The lake stretched out before me, peaceful and unchanging, reflecting the last light of day. Tomorrow would bring new possibilities, new choices, new chances to live authentically. And for the first time since Martha's death, I was genuinely excited to see what those possibilities might hold. I had learned the difference between being alone and being lonely, between being forgotten and choosing solitude, between being abandoned and walking away with dignity. Martha had been right about money revealing character. But she'd also shown me something else, that true wealth isn't measured in dollars, but in the respect and genuine affection of people who choose to be in your life rather than feeling obligated to tolerate your presence. As the stars began to appear over the lake, I smiled and headed back to my cottage. I had phone calls to make, plans to finalize, a life to continue building on my own terms, and that felt like the greatest inheritance of all.